Hello, Ken Spriggs here with part one of my N1 Starfighter build from the Book of Boba Fett, Mandalorian's new ship. And I introduced this in my May the 4th be with you video and was talking about that as a build I want to try to get completed, and I believe I will before Wonderfest, which now is a scant week away. But I have gotten quite a bit done on it, including most of the diorama, which I will show in this video. This is a 3D printed model from gambody.com, and I will put a link in the description. And a really nicely designed model. I did have to do quite a bit of some sanding and modifying, and there'll be some seam filling, but it's going to go together nicely and look really sweet. And I like how it's designed and how it's made. So let's go ahead and take a look at the work that I've begun on it. All right, so I'm working on the lighting for the engines, and I started with the idea, first of all, that I would light just the end with the clear pieces that I've talked about before. This slides down into here. So I made some little caps that I showed in the previous stills that I have a blue Mega SMD in it. And I was only going to have the cap, and it was going to go down into this opening right here and just go glued on flush. And then the wiring would come out through this part here and go through the through a channel that I cut right there. So it would come out, go through that, go through the channel, and come through that little hole into the bottom of the ship. Well, this is upside down, so you wouldn't see it because it would be underneath. And then once I get the wire in, I would putty over that and then sand that smooth. So I was looking at some footage of the ship, and the more I looked at it, the more I realized that the front of the ship, the front of the engine, I mean, glows blue as well. So you have some blue glowing here, and you have blue obviously glowing out of the engines. So I was thinking about a way to do that, and it occurred to me that I could use the same idea with the tube. So initially, I was looking at this tube here, and it was just the right size to fit down into that opening, which is why I got those ends for it. And I figured, oh, wait a minute, I could just do a tube all the way through. So I used my Dremel to completely cut out all of that inside. It's kind of hard to see, but there you go. So it goes all the way through to the front. And I tested a light, and even though this is gray resin, it still glows through pretty nicely. And I'll show you here in a minute. So I can leave that, I can mask the inside of this when I paint the rest of it, because the rest of this is going to be painted with primer, and then it's going to have black over it, and then it's going to have metallic. So it's going to block in any light. The same with this back part, because light can glow through that as well. So what I ended up doing was I took the two Mega SMDs and I rewired them together. And you can see the shrink tube in there, and I ran one wire connected to both of them out to go to through the wing, as I showed. So let me turn that on and I'll show you. All right, so the cool thing is now, because the SMDs are sticking outwards, they're not glowing back into this tube. Very little spill back from that, so it's not going to glow any of the rest of the tube and, you know, accidentally glow through some of these panels or portions or whatever. It's only going to be coming out the front. And this part's pretty thick up here, So it's only really going to glow out of that middle part, especially when I get it painted. And then the back one as well does glow this outer tube a bit, but most of that will have this over it. And again, it'll be painted, so it should cover that up. So, all right, let me get and put that in there, and I'll show you how that's going to look. All right, so there we go. So I just stuck it inside of there. And you can see quite a bit glows through the front of that. The camera's kind of getting some distortion from that blue light. It is glowing through the housing, but like I said, the rest of this I will definitely have several coats of paint over it to mask that. I'll just fill in that front part, and then that ring in the middle and those ribs coming out, I can paint just brush some black over them and dry brush some metallic over it, so it kind of blocks it a little bit, so it doesn't look like the whole entire thing is just glowing. And then you have the back, and a lot more light coming through the back part. All right, so that's going to work just fine. And then I have one single wire coming through that I can run through the wing. Fantastic. All right, so I used my vacuum form machine that I got from Michael's a couple years ago, and I created what they call a POC, maybe that's what it's called, using the cockpit 3D printed part, and I put styrene around it on the bottom edge, and then I filled it with epoxy sculpt and let it harden, because you need something that's solid so the plastic, when it gets sucked down, it goes down around it and not sucked underneath. It would be hard to remove then. And I did the same with the dome. I glued that onto some styrene strips, and then put that down into, or put some 5-minute epoxy sculpt inside of it, and then I vacuum formed them and I trimmed them. It's my first attempt, so I might make a few more just to see, but I think they turn out really cool. So there's Mando in the cockpit with his nicely fitting and perfectly clear vacuum formed canopy. And you got little baby Grogu in the dome with his little bubble. I still have to finish the edge around that dome so it looks more like it's natural. I'll probably just use some stripping. I might even use some styrene stripping around the edge of this canopy to finish it off as well. We'll see. But that's definitely going to be pretty cool, and that's going to work out really well to replace those solid parts. So you can see in there and see my two occupants inside the ship. So fantastic. All right, so I've started gluing together the main body of the ship, the main parts of the ship. Now, this was quite a struggle to get these all to fit, because you have these two halves, you have the back, you have this bottom tub. And so you're lining up all of these things. Like this has to line up, this over here, this groove right here, underneath it. This has to line up, these edges here, all of it. And then on top of it, this piece, which has a lot of compound curves, including this direction, has to fit down inside here and be the bottom. So I had to do a whole lot of sanding and trimming and smoothing just to get it to work. And I ended up having to do quite a bit on this in order to trim this down so it would fit in there once I fixed the rest. So I couldn't get this to work with everything else, but I could get all three of these to work on their own. So I have these glued together with CA glue, and there's some gaps. It's not a big deal. I can easily fill these in. I'll be using Bondo putty, and down here as well. So it shouldn't be a problem to get those smoothed out and look like it's all one piece. And then This piece has a natural edge around it. It's not supposed to be smooth with it. It has an edge around it. So I've decided what I want to do is, since it's going to be tricky to try to wire in all the lights, I figured out that I can literally just put this down on top of this piece and it will go down pretty easily. So I can attach this onto the post that I have for my diorama that I'm going to be building. I'm going to have probably a brass tube that comes up through it, and this is going to be on it, and it's going to be angled. It's going to be facing this way, and it's going to be like angled this way, so the ship itself is flying like this, flying through my canyon I'm going to make. So what I can do is, if I attach this onto the post and have the wiring going into it and just really reinforce that with 5-minute epoxy, so this is solid, I can simply put the ship onto it and it'll be removable, and I can just have a quick disconnect, one of those connectors that I use to unplug it from the wiring and put it on. Now the only thing I'll have to do is this piece right here, which is the back thruster engine, actually will have to be attached onto this because it overlaps, so it goes on like this. But it's not a problem. You have this little groove right here, or not groove, that little piece there that goes into this groove right here. So I don't have to have that glued in. I can glue it onto this piece and simply have that all one piece. In addition, I'm going to have a light in this, just a blue tiny SMD, and there's a hole that comes through, and the hole is also in this. So I could wire that through here and have that wiring already in place, in with my connector. And then all the other lights from the engines will come down and they'll meet in here and have another connector that matches up, and I'll simply just place the whole ship right over top of that and stick it down. And it actually clicks down onto it enough that it will hold the ship up. So let me show you. Yeah, see, that goes down on here pretty well. And again, I'm not gonna fill in the gap around this piece because it's actually a natural seam that's supposed to be there. And not to mention the fact that the ship's going to be angled like this, you're really not going to see that. So I think that's going to work just fine. And I can put the ship onto it. I can remove it for when I take it to the convention and ship it, or box it up and take it down. So I don't have to have this hanging there and dangling on the brass tube and maybe break. So, okay. But before I do anything more with seam work or anything else, I need to get the rest of the engines put in and glued in, the wiring put through. I did go ahead and beef up those grooves so they're ready to go. And I'm going to get the engines glued onto this, and then I can start doing some seam filling and all that. And the other pieces are pretty straightforward. You have some guns up here, you have a couple of other tubes that go on the engines. You have this engine piece which just goes down into here, which I had to sand and make that fit. And I can even paint this separately and put that inside. Of course, the cockpit with Mando, and then the little tail on it. So not too much of that to be worried about. But once I get the main engines on, not the parts that are clear or the back parts that are pointy, I can look at starting to do all the seam patching and then begin looking at painting it. So, all right. All right, so I'm working on the diorama for the N1 Starfighter, and what I'm going to do is having it flying through the canyon, and it's going to be kind of angled, and it's going to be lit up as I showed So what I've done is I took some regular green insulation foam, and I started with the flat base, and then I cut off some pieces that I cut into different ridges, as you can see. So this is going to be the front of it, and the ship itself is going to be flying this direction and kind of angled this way, with a tube going down into this part that'll power it. So what I'm going to do right now, I glued these all together, and they sat all day and they hardened. And I always use my favorite glue, Aleene's Felt and Foam Tacky Glue from Hobby Lobby. Works really well. Holds the foam together, and it hardens, sets up pretty quick. I did this earlier this afternoon, and it's in the evening now. So, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and use this tool now, and I'm going to kind of round off the edges because I want it to look a little more organic, and round these down a bit. And then ultimately what I want to do is I'm going to use the same clay, air hardening clay, that I used on my lunar base for my Ares 1B, and I'm going to mold the walls of this and basically just give it that desert rock look, you know, in the desert floor with some rocks and maybe some other different things on it, and then use some sand material, some sand scenic material, to make it look like it's sandy rock as well. So okay, but let me go ahead and get this shaved down. And I did leave, I wanted to angle this a bit, so I have a nice space back here. So this area would be nice for a AA battery holder. In order to power it, run it through the tube. I have to figure out how I'm going to do that and cover the back so you can't really see it, but we'll work on that and we'll get that done. So, okay. All right, so as I showed in the previous stills, I got quite a bit more done on my diorama base. So the first thing I did, and I like to do this on my bases where I use this foam. The foam is sturdy. It's nice and thick and dense. So I really like using it because it holds together well. But I always like to have the bottom of it a little more secure. So I take a piece of thin wood that I get from a poster frame from Hobby Lobby, and it's actual wood, and I can cut it with my jigsaw. And so I trace out the shape of it to match the bottom of the foam, and then likewise I just use the Aleene's wood foam, or foam and felt glue, to glue it on. It works with wood as well, and I put clamps on it and I let that dry overnight, so that hardened up really nicely. So that gives it a nice solid base on the bottom, holds it all together. And I also went ahead and fashioned and inserted a brass tube, and I positioned it where it needs to be for the ship to go on so it can be connected to it. And I used 5-minute epoxy to glue it down into the foam to come out the back. And I ran a wire through it so the wire's ready to go because it's going to be encased in the back. Let me show you here. So what I did first of all is, because the wood was here, I just cut the foam down and had the wood part right here, deep enough in to hold a AA battery holder to power the lights. And then I put a piece of styrene sheet on it, and I put another one on top and glued that in place with 5-minute epoxy, so I had this opening. And then I went ahead and put my clay down. So I used the same type of air dry clay that I used on my lunar base for my Ares 1B, which is this clay here from Nara, self-hardening clay. I get it at Hobby Lobby. Now I went to get some on Friday, and they only had 2 left at the one I went to, and they had one that was gray like this, and they had one that was flesh toned. So I went ahead and used the flesh tone, as you can see, on the ground, because if you look in the on the show, the ground itself is a lighter sand color than the rocks, which are a lot more of a reddish tone of the sand rocks. So I'm going for that little bit of a contrast there. And the clay is just going to be the base. I'm going to be painting it and putting scenic material on it. So what I did was I used that first of all, and I put it all around the floor of the canyon. And I did it around the edges. And I did, of course, this entire middle section. And it's pretty well dried now. I did it last night, so it's been sitting there at least like maybe 18 hours. And it's already set up, and it's pretty well hardened. Some of the thicker parts might take another day to fully set up, so I'll let that set up. The only thing I didn't do is I didn't do any around the front. I'm just going to do this as kind of a rock face to blend in with that rock face. The sides are done. But I barely had enough, and then I just ran out and used all that up. So I was going to use the dark gray because that's all I had, but then I'd have to do a lot of painting to bring it back up to like a reddish sand color. But instead I went to Michael's and I found some of this, which is another brand, and it's also an air dry clay. Feels about the same in the packaging, but this one's terracotta, so it's already that reddish brown color that I think would be a nice base for the walls as well. In addition, this is twice the size. This one's 35 ounces, whereas the Nara is 17 ounces, a little over 17 and a half ounces. So I'll have twice as much. So I don't have to worry about being able to cover all of this. And some of these are going to be a little thicker because I'm going to have some overhangs and some ridges and other things sticking into it to really contour these rocks to look like I want them to look. And the same with this here. And so that gives me plenty to work with and build that part up next. All right, so let me go ahead and put the next layer of clay over all the rocks, and then that'll kind of finish up the base structure of this, and then I can start working on other things like the scenic material and painting and things like that. All right, so back to plan A. The terracotta clay, the other clay that I got, it just would not stick to this foam at all. I tried it several places, even on some of the rough parts, it just would not stick. Where this sticks very easily. So I went back to the original clay, the gray version, and I used an entire pack of it. I got the entire back of this done in this side, and then I've run out again, so I'm gonna have to go back to the store tomorrow and get some more of this, the gray. So there's the back all done, and that's pretty well set up at this point. So it keeps the texture, but it seems to, some of the sharper edges tend to smooth out. So I think hopefully it'll work better on the front since I have much sharper edges on the front. I have these really sharp overhangs that seem to be doing good. They seem to be sticking there. Yeah, you can see from this angle. And I'll be painting it and putting scenic material over it so I can augment it as well. But I think that'll do well as far as the overall material, the overall texture, to smooth out the foam and make it look more realistic, like a cliff. So, all right, so I have to get more of that, and then I'll be able to finish up the rest of this part and then both sides of this up here in order to get the main structure done. All right, so I did get some more of the same clay that I've been using in the dark gray, just to kind of keep this consistent. And I finished the rest of the back part, and I did the whole front part here. And so let me kind of show you. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. And it did retain more of the sharper edges on the back there, where I had more of overhangs and that sort of thing. And I also have more on this side as well, the inner part. All right, so I will let that dry overnight, And then I'm going to start doing some painting. I figured at this point, because I have the dark gray and it needs to be more of a lighter reddish tan, I'm probably just going to go over it with some white paint to really lighten it up. And then I can go from there. Maybe some white primer or white spray can. And then that way, after that, I can go ahead and start adding the colors I really want. And then some scenic material as well. So, all right. All right, so I started off with just some flat white out of the can, and I sprayed it lightly over top of the gray clay on the back wall and the front wall. So I brought it more towards a very light gray, or a lighter, something easier to go over with the colors that I want. Then I went over the wall parts with some Hall Red from Vallejo, and got that nice and covered around all the sides. And then I went over with a dark tan on the floor parts and around the edges and on the back as well. I'm not going to turn it around, but just to kind of show you. So I like those two complementing colors. And again, these are just kind of the base colors, because I'm going to go over these with sand and other scenic material and that sort of thing to bring it back up. Actually, before I even do that, I'm going to go over it again with some, let me see what I've got here. And the dark tan is a Model Masters, by the way. I think I'm going to go over with some sand and just kind of mist over all of it, kind of blend it together just a little bit and bring them closer to what they ought to be. And then get the tones where I want them to be before I go ahead and apply the scenic sand to it. And then I can even paint over the sand once that fully sets up and dries. So, okay. All right, so last night I went over all of the diorama with just that light sand color, just to kind of tone it back and blend it together some more, so we get a little more of a homogeneous look. Definitely darker on the walls, lighter sand color down on the base, on the floor. So what I'm getting ready to do now is to add in some scenic material. So I have some rocks and gravel. I have some sand. I've used this before. It's really good. It's almost like a powder. It's very, very fine grain, so it goes on a lot better. I get these at Hobby Lobby. And I'm going to be using a couple of glues. I'm going to be using scenic cement, which is a very, very thin, it's almost like a watered down PVA glue. Also going to try to use some of this. This was for my static grass, but it's a little thinner, a little thicker, but it's a glue that sets up. And I believe it dries matte. Yeah, it dries matte. And so does the scenic cement. That's the key to it, is you want it to dry matte, flat coat. When it's done, you don't want it to be glossy or show up. If you use just regular Elmer's glue or PVA glue, it would look crappy and you'd see it coming through. But the fine sand works good on the other stuff, and oftentimes I'll put it in a spray bottle, spray it down, and then saturate the sand once I put it on, and it hardens on nice and good, nice and well. So, all right, so let me start working on putting on some of this scenic material to get this looking more like a rock-strewn canyon. All right, so I applied a lot of the sand onto the base, and it's tricky because what I have to do is work from, you want to keep it horizontal. So when I did the front of this and the front of this wall, I had it upside down the other way. And you have to put it on, especially when you have like these rocks. So I put the thicker glue in where the rocks are going to go, and I put them down into it. And then I use a little spray bottle with the glue in it, and I spray it all over it liberally. And then I just have some of the sand in a cup, and I just sprinkle it on. and then I soak it down with more glue, put some more on, soak it down again. You cannot oversaturate this. The glue will evaporate within like a day, and it will leave behind a matte finish, and the sand will be nice and congealed. So you can see that the part right now that has rocks on the floor, they're not falling down because they're nice and solidly glued in place. Now, if you wanted to, you could kind of break one off, but you know, just have to be cautious and careful. And again, it doesn't hurt to really soak this with that scenic cement, really thin glue, and get it all in place. So, and then I do the same with the sides. I had to prop it up on its side and put it on. Now I'm having mostly just sand on the back. The front has just sand, but rocks in any of the places where there's crevices and ledges and things like that. So, all right, so this is the last of it. I'm just gonna finish this up, let that set up for a few hours, and then I'll be able to sit it back on upright on its normal thing, and I can patch up any little spots with either some of the scenic cement or that thicker glue that I use for the static grass. So, all right, but looking pretty fantastic. All right, and there is the sand and rocks all applied to my diorama. So the diorama is pretty well complete at this point. I'm just gonna let that set at least for a day and just everything congeal and harden and crystallize on it. I'll kind of show you around it. And I forgot to mention, I have it in this box because obviously it contains all of the sand and rocks and everything that comes loose. So it all goes in the bottom, so in the end I can just throw this away or just dump it in the garbage and not make a mess. It's a lot easier to work this way. But there's the back of it. I didn't put as much detail on the back, of course, as I did on the rest of it. But looking pretty cool. Now, once it's all fully set up and dried, I will probably go back and add maybe a little bit of traces of some green scrub or something on it, because there probably would be. Maybe even do a little bit of painting and highlighting in certain areas. but it looks pretty good. And I'll probably end up doing that once I get the ship ready to go. There's the post where it's gonna be positioned and the wire sticking out. You can barely see it there. And I did paint that and even drop some sand on it so it kind of blends into the scenery, but you won't see it because the ship will be on it and obscuring this whole area. So, all right, but looking pretty cool. So that is pretty much all completed. So now on to the ship and finishing working on that and getting that together and painted. All right, so that's gonna wrap up this video for this week. And I should have just one more video on this for next week, right before I go to Wonderfest. Otherwise, I'm not gonna have it done in time, but I should have it done in time. So there should be one more video showing the completion of the ship, getting it painted, getting the lights all working on it, and getting it put up onto the diorama. So, all right. So have a happy Memorial Day, everybody. And I will see you next time. Thanks a lot.